Chapters 53 and 54 of Phineas Finn, the Irish Member. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Phineas Finn, the Irish Member, by Anthony Trollope. Chapters 53 and 54. Chapter 53, showing how Phineas bore the blow. When Phineas received Lady Laura Kennedy's letter, he was sitting in his gorgeous apartment in the Colonial Office. It was gorgeous in comparison with the very dingy room at Mr. Lowe's, to which he had been accustomed in his early days, and somewhat gorgeous also as compared with the lodgings he had so long inhabited in Mr. Bunce's house. The room was large and square, and looked out from 3 windows on to St. James's Park. There were in it 2 very comfortable armchairs and a comfortable sofa, and the office table at which he sat was of old mahogany, shining brightly, and seemed to be fitted up with every possible appliance for official comfort. This stood near one of the windows, so that he could sit and look down upon the park. And there was a large round table covered with books and newspapers, and the walls of the room were bright with maps of all the colonies. And there was one very interesting map, but not very bright, showing the American colonies as they used to be. And there was a little inner closet in which he could brush his hair and wash his hands, and in the room adjoining there sat, or ought to have sat, for he was often absent, vexing the mind of Phineas, the Earl's nephew, his private secretary, and it was all very gorgeous. Often as he looked round upon it, thinking of his old bedroom at Killaloe, of his little garrets at Trinity, of the dingy chambers in Lincoln's Inn, he would tell himself that it was very gorgeous. He would wonder that anything so grand had fallen to his lot. The letter from Scotland was brought to him in the afternoon, having reached London by some day mail from Glasgow. He was sitting at his desk with a heap of papers before him, referring to a contemplated railway from Halifax, in Nova Scotia, to the foot of the Rocky Mountains. It had become his business to get up the subject, and then discuss with his principal, Lord Cantrip, the expediency of advising the government to lend a company 5 million of money in order that this railway might be made. It was a big subject, and the contemplation of it gratified him. It required that he should look forward to great events, and exercise the wisdom of a statesman. What was the chance of these colonies being swallowed up by those other regions, once colonies, of which the map that hung in the corner told so eloquent a tale? And if so, would the 5 million ever be repaid? And if not swallowed up, were the colonies worth so great an adventure of national money? Could they repay it? Would they do so? Should they be made to do so? Mr. Lowe, who was now a Q.C. and in Parliament, would not have greater subject than this before him, even if he should come to be Solicitor General. Lord Cantrip had specially asked him to get up this matter, and he was getting it up sedulously. Once in 9 years the harbour of Halifax was blocked up by ice. He had just jotted down the fact, which was material, when Lady Laura's letter was brought to him. He read it, and putting it down by his side very gently, went back to his maps, as though the thing would not so trouble his mind as to disturb his work. He absolutely wrote, automatically, certain words of a note about the harbour after he had received the information. A horse will gallop for some scores of yards after his back has been broken before he knows of his great ruin, and so it was with Phineas Finn. His back was broken, but nevertheless he galloped for a yard or 2. Closed in 1860–61 for 13 days. Then he began to be aware that his back was broken, and that the writing of any more notes about the ice in Halifax harbour was for the present out of the question. I think it best to let you know immediately that she has accepted him. These were the words which he read the oftenest, then it was all over. The game was played out, and all his victories were as nothing to him. He sat for an hour in his gorgeous room thinking of it, and various were the answers which he gave during the time to various messages, but he would see nobody. As for the colonies, he did not care if they revolted tomorrow. He would have parted with every colony belonging to Great Britain to have gotten the hand of Violet Effingham for himself. Now at this moment, he told himself with oaths that he had never loved any one but Violet Effingham. There had been so much to make such a marriage desirable. I should wrong my hero deeply were I to say that the weight of his sorrow was occasioned by the fact that he had lost an heiress. He would never have thought of looking for Violet Effingham had he not first learned to love her. But as the idea opened itself out to him, everything had seemed to be so suitable. Had Miss Effingham become his wife, the mouths of the Lowes and of the Bunces would have been stopped altogether. Mr. Monk would have come to his house as his familiar guest, and he would have been connected with half a score of peers. A seat in Parliament would be simply his proper place, and even under-secretaryships of state might soon come to be below him. He was playing a great game, but hitherto he had played it with so much success, with such wonderful luck, that it had seemed to him that all things were within his reach. Nothing more had been wanting to him than Violet's hand for his own comfort, and Violet's fortune to support his position, and these two had almost seemed to be within his grasp. His goddess had indeed refused him, but not with disdain. Even Lady Laura had talked of his marriage as not improbable. All the world, almost, had heard of the duel, and all the world had smiled, and seemed to think that in the real fight Phineas Finn would be the victor, that the lucky pistol was in his hands. It had never occurred to any one to suppose, as far as he could see, that he was presuming at all, or pushing himself out of his own sphere, in asking Violet Effingham to be his wife. No, he would trust his luck, would persevere, and would succeed. Such had been his resolution on that very morning, and now there had come this letter to dash him to the ground. There were moments in which he declared to himself that he would not believe the letter. Not that there was any moment in which there was in his mind the slightest spark of real hope, but he would tell himself that he would still persevere. Violet might have been driven to accept that violent man by violent influence, or it might be that she had not in truth accepted him, that Chiltern had simply so asserted. Or, even if it were so, did women never change their minds? The manly thing would be to persevere to the end. Had he not before been successful, when success seemed to be as far from him? But he could buoy himself up with no real hope. Even when these ideas were present to his mind, he knew well, at those very moments, that his back was broken. Some one had come in and lighted the candles and drawn down the blinds while he was sitting there, and now, as he looked at his watch, he found that it was past 5 o'clock. He was engaged to dine with Madame Max Goesler at 8, and in his agony he half resolved that he would send an excuse. Madame Max would be full of wrath, as she was very particular about her little dinner parties, but what did he care now about the wrath of Madame Max Goesler? And yet only this morning he had been congratulating himself, among his other successes, upon her favour, and had laughed inwardly at his own falseness, his falseness to Violet Effingham, as he did so. He had said something to himself jocosely about lovers' perjuries, the remembrance of which was now very bitter to him. He took up a sheet of note-paper and scrawled an excuse to Madame Goesler. News from the country, he said, made it impossible that he should go out tonight. But he did not send the note. At about 5:30 he opened the door of his private secretary's room, and found the young man fast asleep with a cigar in his mouth. "Hello, Charles," he said. "All right." Charles Standish was a first cousin of Lady Laura's, and, having been in the office before Phineas had joined it, and being a great favourite with his cousin, had of course become the Under-Secretary's private secretary. "I'm all here," said Charles Standish, getting up and shaking himself. "I'm going. Just tie up those papers exactly as they are. I shall be here early tomorrow, but I shan't want you before 12. Good night, Charles." "Ta-ta," said his private secretary, who was very fond of his master, but not very respectful, unless upon express occasions. Then Phineas went out and walked across the park. But as he went he became quite aware that his back was broken. It was not the less broken because he sang to himself little songs to prove to himself that it was whole and sound. It was broken, and it seemed to him now that he never could become an Atlas again, to bear the weight of the world upon his shoulders. What did anything signify? All that he had done had been part of a game which he had been playing throughout, and now he had been beaten in his game. He absolutely ignored his old passion for Lady Laura as though it had never been, and regarded himself as a model of constancy, as a man who had loved, not wisely perhaps, but much too well, and who must now therefore suffer a living death. He hated Parliament. He hated the Colonial Office. He hated his friend Mr. Monk, and he especially hated Madame Max Goesler. As to Lord Chiltern, he believed that Lord Chiltern had obtained his object by violence. He would see to that. Yes, let the consequences be what they might, he would see to that. He went up by the Duke of York's column, and as he passed the Athenaeum he saw his chief, Lord Cantrip, standing under the portico talking to a bishop. He would have gone on unnoticed had it been possible, but Lord Cantrip came down to him at once. "I've put your name down here," said his lordship. "What's the use?" said Phineas, who was profoundly indifferent at this moment to all the clubs in London. "It can't do any harm, you know. You'll come up in time, and if you should get into the ministry, they'll let you in at once." "Ministry!" ejaculated Phineas. But Lord Cantrip took the tone of voice as simply suggestive of humility, and suspected nothing of that profound indifference to all ministers and ministerial honours which Phineas had intended to express. "By the by," said Lord Cantrip, putting his arm through that of the Under Secretary, "I want to speak to you about the guarantees. We shall be in the devil's own mess, you know." And so the Secretary of State went on about the Rocky Mountain Railroad, and Phineas strove hard to bear his burden with his broken back. He was obliged to say something about the guarantees, and the railway, and the frozen harbour, and something especially about the difficulties which would be found, not in the measures themselves, but in the natural pugnacity of the opposition. In the fabrication of the garments for the national wear, the great thing is to produce garments that shall, as far as possible, defy hole-picking. It may be, and sometimes is the case, that garments so fabricated will be good also for wear. Lord Cantrip, at the present moment, was very anxious and very ingenious in the stopping of holes, and he thought that perhaps his Under Secretary was too much prone to the indulgence of large philanthropical views without sufficient thought of the hole-pickers. But on this occasion, by the time that he reached Brooks's, he had been enabled to convince his Under Secretary, and though he had always thought well of his Under Secretary, he thought better of him now than ever he had done. Phineas during the whole time had been meditating what he could do to Lord Chiltern when they two should meet. Could he take him by the throat and smite him? "I happen to know that Broderick is working as hard at the matter as we are," said Lord Cantrip, stopping opposite to the club. "He moved for papers, you know, at the end of last session." Now Mr. Broderick was a gentleman in the House looking for promotion in a Conservative government, and of course would oppose any measure that could be brought forward by the Cantrip Finn colonial administration. Then Lord Cantrip slipped into the club, and Phineas went on alone. A spark of his old ambition with reference to Brooks's was the first thing to make him forget his misery for a moment. He had asked Lord Brentford to put his name down, and was not sure whether it had been done. The threat of Mr. Broderick's opposition had been of no use towards the strengthening of his broken back, but the sight of Lord Cantrip hurrying in at the coveted door did do something. "A man can't cut his throat or blow his brains out," he said to himself. "After all, he must go on and do his work, for hearts will break, yet brokenly live on." Thereupon he went home, and after sitting for an hour over his own fire, and looking wistfully at a little treasure which he had, a treasure obtained by some slight fraud at Salisbury, and which he now chucked into the fire, and then instantly again pulled out of it, soiled but unscorched, he dressed himself for dinner, and went out to Madame Max Goesler's. Upon the whole, he was glad that he had not sent the note of excuse. A man must live, even though his heart be broken, and living he must dine. Madame Max Goesler was fond of giving little dinners at this period of the year, before London was crowded, and when her guests might probably not be called away by subsequent social arrangements. Her number seldom exceeded 6 or 8, and she always spoke of these entertainments as being of the humblest kind. She sent out no big cards. She preferred to catch her people as though by chance, when that was possible. "Dear Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith is coming to tell me about some sherry on Tuesday. Will you come and tell me too? I dare say you know as much about it." And then there was a studious absence of parade. The dishes were not very numerous. The bill of fare was simply written out once for the mistress, and so circulated round the table. Not a word about the things to be eaten or the things to be drunk was ever spoken at the table, or at least no such word was ever spoken by Madame Goesler. But nevertheless, they who knew anything about dinners were aware that Madame Goesler gave very good dinners indeed. Phineas Finn was beginning to flatter himself that he knew something about dinners, and had been heard to assert that the soups at the cottage in Park Lane were not to be beaten in London. But he cared for no soup to-day, as he slowly made his way up Madame Goesler's staircase. There had been one difficulty in the way of Madame Goesler's dinner parties, which had required some patience and great ingenuity in its management. She must either have ladies, or she must not have them. There was a great allurement in the latter alternative, but she knew well that if she gave way to it, all prospect of general society would for her be closed, and for ever. This had been in the early days of her widowhood in Park Lane. She cared but little for women's society, but she knew well that the society of gentlemen without women would not be that which she desired. She knew also that she might as effectually crush herself and all her aspirations by bringing to her house indifferent women, women lacking something either in character or in position or in talent, as by having none at all. Thus there had been a great difficulty, and sometimes she had thought that the thing could not be done at all. "These English are so stiff, so hard, so heavy," and yet she would not have cared to succeed elsewhere than among the English. By degrees, however, the thing was done. Her prudence equalled her wit, and even suspicious people had come to acknowledge that they could not put their fingers on anything wrong. When Lady Glencora Palliser had once dined at the cottage in Park Lane, Madame Max Goesler had told herself that henceforth she did not care what the suspicious people said, since that the Duke of Omnium had almost promised that he would come. If she could only entertain the Duke of Omnium, she would have done everything. But there was no Duke of Omnium there to-night. At this time the Duke of Omnium was, of course, not in London, but Lord Fawn was there, and our old friend Lawrence Fitzgibbon, who had resigned his place at the Colonial Office, and there were Mr. and Mrs. Bonteen. They, with our hero, made up the party. No one doubted for a moment to what source Mr. Bonteen owed his dinner. Mrs. Bonteen was good-looking, could talk, was sufficiently proper, and all that kind of thing, and did as well as any other woman at this time of year to keep Madame Max Goesler in countenance. There was never any sitting after dinner at the cottage, or I should rather say there was never any sitting after Madame Goesler went, so that the two ladies could not weary each other by being alone together. Mrs. Bonteen understood quite well that she was not required there to talk to her hostess, and was as willing as any woman to make herself agreeable to the gentlemen she might meet at Madame Goesler's table. And thus Mr. and Mrs. Bonteen not unfrequently dined in Park Lane. "Now we have only to wait for that horrible man, Mr. Fitzgibbon," said Madame Max Goesler, as she welcomed Phineas. "He is always late." "What a blow for me," said Phineas. "No, you are always in good time. But there is a limit beyond which good time ends and being shamefully late at once begins. Ah, but here he is." And then, as Lawrence Fitzgibbon entered the room, Madame Goesler rang the bell for dinner. Phineas found himself placed between his hostess and Mr. Bonteen, and Lord Fawn was on the other side of Madame Goesler. They were hardly seated at the table before some one stated it as a fact that Lord Brentford and his son were reconciled. Now Phineas knew, or thought that he knew, that this could not as yet be the case, and indeed such was not the case, though the father had already received the son's letter. But Phineas did not choose to say anything at present about Lord Chiltern. "How odd it is," said Madame Goesler, "how often you English fathers quarrel with your sons." "How often we English sons quarrel with our fathers, rather," said Lord Fawn, who was known for the respect he had always paid to the fifth commandment. "It all comes from entail and primogeniture and old-fashioned English prejudices of that kind," said Madame Goesler. "Lord Chiltern is a friend of yours, Mr. Finn, I think." "They're both friends of mine," said Phineas. "Ah, yes, but you and Lord Chiltern once did something odd together. There was a little mystery, was there not?" "It is a very little of a mystery now," said Fitzgibbon. "It was about a lady, was it not?" said Mrs. Bonteen, affecting to whisper to her neighbour. "I am not at liberty to say anything on the subject," said Fitzgibbon, "but I've no doubt Phineas will tell you." "I don't believe this about Lord Brentford," said Mr. Bonteen. "I happen to know that Chiltern was down at Loughlinter 3 days ago, and that he passed through London yesterday on his way to the place where he hunts. The Earl is at Salisbury. He would have gone to Salisbury if it were true." "It all depends upon whether Miss Effingham will accept him," said Mrs. Bonteen, looking over at Phineas as she spoke. As there were two of Violet Effingham's suitors at the table, the subject was becoming disagreeably personal, and the more so as every one of the party knew or surmised something of the facts of the case. The cause of the duel at Blankenberg had become almost as public as the duel, and Lord Fawn's courtship had not been altogether hidden from the public eye. He on the present occasion might probably be able to carry himself better than Phineas, even presuming him to be equally eager in his love, for he knew nothing of the fatal truth. But he was unable to hear Mrs. Bonteen's statement with indifference, and showed his concern in the matter by his reply. "Any lady will be much to be pitied," he said, "who does that. Chiltern is the last man in the world to whom I would wish to trust the happiness of a woman for whom I cared." "Chiltern is a very good fellow," said Lawrence Fitzgibbon. "Just a little wild," said Mrs. Bonteen. "And never had a shilling in his pocket in his life," said her husband. "I regard him as simply a madman," said Lord Fawn. "I do so wish I knew him," said Madame Max Goesler. "I am fond of madmen, and men who haven't shillings, and who are a little wild. Could you not bring him here, Mr. Finn?" Phineas did not know what to say, or how to open his mouth without showing his deep concern. "I shall be happy to ask him if you wish it," he replied, as though the question had been put to him in earnest. "But I do not see so much of Lord Chiltern as I used to do." "You do not believe that Violet Effingham will accept him?" asked Mrs. Bonteen. He paused a moment before he spoke, and then made his answer in a deep, solemn voice, with a seriousness which he was unable to repress. "She has accepted him," he said. "Do you mean that you know it?" said Madame Goesler. "Yes, I mean that I know it." Had anybody told him beforehand that he would openly make this declaration at Madame Goesler's table, he would have said that of all things it was the most impossible. He would have declared that nothing would have induced him to speak of Violet Effingham in his existing frame of mind, and that he would have had his tongue cut out before he spoke of her as the promised bride of his rival. And now he had declared the whole truth of his own wretchedness and discomfiture. He was well aware that all of them there knew why he had fought the duel at Blankenberg, all, that is, except perhaps Lord Fawn, and he felt as he made the statement as to Lord Chiltern that he blushed up to his forehead, and that his voice was strange, and that he was telling the tale of his own disgrace. But when the direct question had been asked him, he had been unable to refrain from answering it directly. He had thought of turning it off with some jest or affectation of drollery, but had failed. At the moment he had been unable not to speak the truth. "I don't believe a word of it," said Lord Fawn, who also forgot himself. "I do believe it, if Mr. Finn says so," said Mrs. Bonteen, who rather liked the confusion she had caused. "But who could have told you, Finn?" asked Mr. Bonteen. "His sister, Lady Laura, told me so," said Phineas. "Then it must be true," said Madame Goesler. "It is quite impossible," said Lord Fawn. "I think I may say that I know it is impossible. If it were so, it would be a most shameful arrangement. Every shilling she has in the world would be swallowed up." Now, Lord Fawn, in making his proposals, had been magnanimous in his offers as to settlements and pecuniary provisions generally. For some minutes after that Phineas did not speak another word, and the conversation generally was not so brisk and bright as it was expected to be at Madame Goesler's. Madame Max Goesler herself thoroughly understood our hero's position, and felt for him. She would have encouraged no questionings about Violet Effingham had she thought that they would have led to such a result, and now she exerted herself to turn the minds of her guests to other subjects. At last she succeeded, and after a while, too, Phineas himself was able to talk. He drank 2 or 3 glasses of wine, and dashed away into politics, taking the earliest opportunity in his power of contradicting Lord Fawn very plainly on 1 or 2 matters. Laurence Fitzgibbon was of course of opinion that the ministry could not stay in long. Since he had left the government the ministers had made wonderful mistakes, and he spoke of them quite as an enemy might speak. "And yet, Fitz," said Mr. Bonteen, "you used to be so staunch a supporter." "I've seen the error of my way, I can assure you," said Laurence. "I always observe," said Madame Max Goesler, "that when any of you gentlemen resign, which you usually do on some very trivial matter, the resigning gentleman becomes of all foes the bitterest. Somebody goes on very well with his friends, agreeing most cordially about everything, till he finds that his public virtue cannot swallow some little detail, and then he resigns. Or someone, perhaps, on the other side has attacked him, and in the melee he's hurt, and so he resigns. But when he has resigned, and made his parting speech full of love and gratitude, I know well after that where to look for the bitterest hostility to his late friends. Yes, I am beginning to understand the way in which politics are done in England." All this was rather severe upon Laurence Fitzgibbon, but he was a man of the world, and bore it better than Phineas had borne his defeat. The dinner, taken altogether, was not a success, and so Madame Goesler understood. Lord Fawn, after he had been contradicted by Phineas, hardly opened his mouth. Phineas himself talked rather too much and rather too loudly, and Mrs. Bonteen, who was well enough inclined to flatter Lord Fawn, contradicted him. "I made a mistake," said Madame Goesler afterwards, "in having 4 members of Parliament who all of them were or had been in office. I never will have 2 men in office together again." This she said to Mrs. Bonteen. "My dear Madame Max," said Mrs. Bonteen, Your resolution ought to be that you will never again have two claimants for the same young lady." In the drawing-room upstairs, Madame Goesler managed to be alone for 3 minutes with Phineas Finn. "And it is as you say, my friend?" she asked. Her voice was plaintive and soft, and there was a look of real sympathy in her eyes. Phineas almost felt that if they two had been quite alone, he could have told her everything, and have wept at her feet. "Yes," he said, "it is so. I never doubted it when you had declared it. May I venture to say that I wish it had been otherwise? It's too late now, Madame Goesler. A man, of course, is a fool to show that he has any feelings in such a matter. The fact is, I heard it just before I came here, and had made up my mind to send you an excuse. I wish I had now. Do not say that, Mr. Finn. I've made such an ass of myself." "In my estimation you have done yourself honour. But, if I may venture to give you counsel, do not speak of this affair again as though you had been personally concerned in it. In the world nowadays, the only thing disgraceful is to admit a failure. And I have failed. But you need not admit it, Mr. Finn. I know I ought not to say as much to you. I rather am deeply indebted to you. I'll go now, Madame Goesler, as I do not wish to leave the house with Lord Fawn." "But you will come and see me soon?" Then Phineas promised that he would come soon, and felt as he made the promise that he would have an opportunity of talking over his love with his new friend, at any rate without fresh shame as to his failure. Laurence Fitzgibbon went away with Phineas, and Mr. Bonteen, having sent his wife away by herself, walked off towards the clubs with Lord Fawn. He was very anxious to have a few words with Lord Fawn. Lord Fawn had evidently been annoyed by Phineas, and Mr. Bonteen did not at all love the young Under Secretary. "That fellow has become the most consummate puppy I ever met," said he, as he linked himself on to the Lord. "Monk and one or two others among them have contrived to spoil him altogether." "I don't believe a word of what he said about Lord Chiltern," said Lord Fawn. "About his marriage with Miss Effingham?" "It would be such an abominable shame to sacrifice the girl," said Lord Fawn. "Only think of it. Everything is gone. The man is a drunkard, and I don't believe he is any more reconciled to his father than you are. Lady Laura Kennedy must have had some object in saying so." "Perhaps an invention of Finn's altogether," said Mr. Bonteen. "Those Irish fellows are just the men for that kind of thing." "A man, you know, so violent that nobody can hold him," said Lord Fawn, thinking of Chiltern. "And so absurdly conceited," said Mr. Bonteen, thinking of Phineas. "A man who has never done anything with all his advantages in the world, and never will." "He won't hold his place long," said Mr. Bonteen. "Whom do you mean?" "Phineas Finn." "Oh, Mr. Finn! I was talking of Lord Chiltern. I believe Finn to be a very good sort of a fellow, and he's undoubtedly clever. They say Cantrip likes him amazingly. He'll do very well. But I don't believe a word of this about Lord Chiltern." Then Mr. Bonteen felt himself to be snubbed, and soon afterwards left Lord Fawn alone. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54. Consolation. On the day following Madame Goesler's dinner party, Phineas, though he was early at his office, was not able to do much work, still feeling that as regarded the realities of the world his back was broken. He might, no doubt, go on learning, and, after a time, might be able to exert himself in a perhaps useful but altogether uninteresting kind of way, doing his work simply because it was there to be done, as the carter or the tailor does his, and from the same cause, knowing that a man must have bread to live. But as for ambition, and the idea of doing good, and the love of work for work's sake, as for the elastic springs of delicious and beneficent labour, all that was over for him. He would have worked from day till night, and from night till day, and from month till month throughout the year, to have secured for Violet Effingham the assurance that her husband's position was worthy of her own. But now he had no motive for such work as this. As long as he took the public pay, he would earn it, and that was all. On the next day things were a little better with him. He received a note in the morning from Lord Cantrip, saying that they too were to see the Prime Minister that evening, in order that the whole question of the railway to the Rocky Mountains might be understood, and Phineas was driven to his work. Before the time of the meeting came, he had once more lost his own identity in great ideas of colonial welfare, and had planned and peopled a mighty region on the Red River, which should have no sympathy with American democracy. When he waited upon Mr. Gresham in the afternoon, he said nothing about the mighty region. Indeed, he left it to Lord Cantrip to explain most of the proposed arrangements, speaking only a word or two here and there as occasion required. But he was aware that he had so far recovered as to be able to save himself from losing ground during the interview. "He's about the first Irishman we've had that has been worth his salt," said Mr. Gresham to his colleague afterwards. "That other Irishman was a terrible fellow," said Lord Cantrip, shaking his head. On the fourth day after his sorrow had befallen him, Phineas went again to the cottage in Park Lane, and in order that he might not be balked in his search for sympathy, he wrote a line to Madame Goesler to ask if she would be at home. "I'll be at home from 5 to 6, and alone. M.M.G." That was the answer from Marie Max Goesler, and Phineas was of course at the cottage a few minutes after 5. It is not, I think, surprising that a man, when he wants sympathy in such a calamity as that which had now befallen Phineas Finn, should seek it from a woman. Women sympathize most effectually with men, as men do with women. But it is perhaps a little odd that a man, when he wants consolation because his heart has been broken, always likes to receive it from a pretty woman. One would be disposed to think that at such a moment he would be profoundly indifferent to such a matter, that no delight could come to him from female beauty, and that all he would want would be the softness of a simply sympathetic soul. But he generally wants a soft hand as well, and an eye that can be bright behind the mutual tear, and lips that shall be young and fresh as they express their concern for his sorrow. All these things were added to Phineas when he went to Madame Goesler in his grief. "I am so glad to see you," said Madame Max. "You are very good-natured to let me come." "No, but it is so good of you to trust me. But I was sure you would come after what took place the other night. I saw that you were pained, and I was so sorry for it." "I made such a fool of myself." "Not at all. And I thought that you were right to tell them when the question had been asked. If the thing was not to be kept a secret, it was better to speak it out. You will get over it quicker in that way than in any other. I have never seen the young lord myself." "Oh, there is nothing amiss about him. As to what Lord Fawn said, the half of it is simply exaggeration, and the other half is misunderstood." "In this country it is so much to be a lord," said Madame Goesler. Phineas thought a moment of that matter before he replied. All the Standish family had been very good to him, and Violet Effingham had been very good. It was not the fault of any of them that he was now wretched and back-broken. He had meditated much on this, and had resolved that he would not even think evil of them. "I do not in my heart believe that that has had anything to do with it," he said. "But it has, my friend, always. I do not know your Violet Effingham." "She is not mine." "Well, I do not know this Violet that is not yours. I have met her, and did not specially admire her. But then the tastes of men and women about beauty are never the same. But I know she is one that always lives with lords and countesses. A girl who always lived with countesses feels it to be hard to settle down as a plain mistress." "She has had plenty of choice among all sorts of men. It was not the title. She would not have accepted Chiltern unless she had But what's the use of talking of it?" "They had known each other long?" "Oh yes, as children. And the Earl desired it of all things." "Ah, then he arranged it." "Not exactly. Nobody could arrange anything for Chiltern, nor, as far as that goes, for Miss Effingham. They arranged it themselves, I fancy." "You had asked her?" "Yes, twice, and she had refused him more than twice. I have nothing for which to blame her, but yet I had thought. "She is a jilt, then?" "No, I will not let you say that of her. She is no jilt. But I think she has been strangely ignorant of her own mind. What is the use of talking of it, Madame Goesler?" "None. Only sometimes it is better to speak a word than to keep one's sorrow to oneself." "So it is. And there is not one in the world to whom I can speak such a word, except yourself. Is not that odd? I have sisters, but they have never heard of Miss Effingham, and would be quite indifferent." "Perhaps they have some other favourites." "Ah, well, that does not matter. And my best friend here in London is Lord Chiltern's own sister." "She knew of your attachment?" "Oh yes." "And she told you of Miss Effingham's engagement? Was she glad of it?" "She has always desired the marriage, and yet I think she would have been satisfied had it been otherwise. But of course her heart must be with her brother. I need not have troubled myself to go to Blankenberg after all." "It was for the best, perhaps. Everybody says you behaved so well." "I could not but go, as things were then." "What if you had shot him?" "There would have been an end of everything. She would never have seen me after that. Indeed, I should have shot myself next, feeling that there was nothing else left for me to do." "Ah, you English are so peculiar. But I suppose it is best not to shoot a man. And, Mr. Finn, there are other ladies in the world prettier than Miss Violet Effingham." "No, of course you will not admit that now. Just at this moment and for a month or two she is peerless, and you will feel yourself to be of all men the most unfortunate. But you have the ball at your feet. I know no one so young who has got the ball at his feet so well. I call it nothing to have the ball at your feet if you are born with it there. It is so easy to be a lord if your father is one before you, and so easy to marry a pretty girl if you can make her a countess. But to make yourself a lord, or to be as good as a lord when nothing has been born to you, that I call very much. And there are women, and pretty women too, Mr. Finn, who have spirit enough to understand this, and to think that the man, after all, is more important than the lord." Then she sang the old well-worn verse of the Scotch song with wonderful spirit, and with a clearness of voice and knowledge of music for which he had hitherto never given her credit. "A prince can mak a belted knight, a marquis duke and a' that, but an honest man's aboon his might, guid faith he mauna fa' that." "I did not know that you sung, Madame Goesler." "Only now and then when something specially requires it, and I am very fond of Scotch songs. I will sing to you now if you like it." Then she sang the whole song, "A man's a man for a' that." She said as she finished, "Even though he cannot get the special bit of painted Eve's flesh for which his heart has had a craving." Then she sang again, "There are maidens in Scotland more lovely by far, who would gladly be bride to the young Lochinvar." "What's young Lochinvar got his bride?" said Phineas. "Take the spirit of the lines, Mr. Finn, which is true, and not the tale as it is told, which is probably false. I often think that Jock of Hazeldene, and young Lochinvar too, probably lived to repent their bargains. We will hope that Lord Chiltern may not do so. I am sure he never will. That is all right. And as for you, do you for a while think of your politics and your speeches and your colonies rather than of your love. You are at home there, and no Lord Chiltern can rob you of your success. And if you are down in the mouth, come to me, and I will sing you a Scotch song. And, look you, the next time I ask you to dinner, I will promise you that Mrs. Bonteen shall not be here. Good-bye." She gave him her hand, which was very soft, and left it for a moment in his, and he was consoled. Madame Goesler, when she was alone, threw herself onto her chair and began to think of things. In these days she would often ask herself what in truth was the object of her ambition and the aim of her life. Now at this moment she had in her hand a note from the Duke of Omnium. The Duke had allowed himself to say something about a photograph, which had justified her in writing to him, or which she had taken for such justification. And the Duke had replied, he would not, he said, lose the opportunity of waiting upon her in person, which the presentation of the little gift might afford him. It would be a great success to have the Duke of Omnium at her house. But to what would the success reach? What was her definite object? Or had she any? In what way could she make herself happy? She could not say that she was happy yet. The hours with her were too long, and the days too many. The Duke of Omnium should come if he would, and she was quite resolved as to this, that if the Duke did come, she would not be afraid of him. Heavens and earth! What would be the feelings of such a woman as her, were the world to greet her some fine morning as Duchess of Omnium? And she made up her mind very resolutely on one subject. Should the Duke give her any opportunity, she would take a very short time in letting him know what was the extent of her ambition. Chapter 54.